I think that, as social service agencies, we definitely have to continue to check that, right?
Yeah.
What level of trauma are we willing to deal with, right? Because when we think about people of color, they're coming with a lot of trauma, right? We've got some generational trauma, historical trauma. We have victims of trafficking, and all these levels of oppression. So we have to know if we're even able and competent to really deal with those things. And then I think on the flip side of that, also being willing to learn how to, right? Because then I don't want to say close the door because you're not able to. But if you want to serve trafficking victims, you have to be ready to deal with all of the things that they bring.
Hey, welcome to the Elijah Rising podcast, where we discuss the myths, misconceptions, and most asked questions about sex trafficking. I'm Adam, and today I am joined by Shani Bacy, the Director of Strategic Programs at The Landing, which is a Houston-based nonprofit empowering survivors of human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, primarily through their drop-in center on Bissonnette Street, located here in Houston. Shani, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
I'm so excited that you're here. We appreciate you having this conversation with us. This is the second conversation that we've had focused on the intersection between sex trafficking and racial justice. And the reason for that is because we at Elijah Rising are committed to raising awareness about sex trafficking and serving those who are exploited by the sex industry, much like you, Shani, and The Landing. But we here at Elijah Rising, we recognize that racism is a major cause of sex trafficking and a demand driver of sex trafficking. And as a justice-oriented organization who serves women of color, we recognize the need to be better informed about the intersection between sex trafficking and racism. And so, again, on the podcast, we're going to ask the question, is sex trafficking, is prostitution a racial justice issue? Shani, you have a ton of experience in the anti-trafficking movement. You're a leader in awareness, in prevention, in advocacy. You have worked for multiple anti-trafficking agencies here in Houston. You have all the experience. And in all those years of experience, in all those different roles and in all those different ways, first question I want to pose to you is, do you think that people have attempted to fight sex trafficking while ignoring racism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me first say thank you for having me here. And thanks for having this conversation, because I think this has been long overdue. And you guys have just really been at the forefront of this conversation. And so your leadership in this has really been inspiring to me, as a woman of color working in this space. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think I've been really fortunate to kind of have a wide range of experiences working in this space. And so working in residential programs and working in the criminal justice system, and then like currently where we are now at The Landing, doing drop-in center, a drop-in center and outreach, and recently youth advocacy work. And so, I think I have maybe a perspective that, has been able to travel from, different agencies. And so,
absolutely,
I definitely have opinions, but it's been a challenge. And I think your question is really important. Have we tried to, do this work without addressing racism? And research shows that people of color are disproportionately impacted, by human trafficking, by the sex industry. And there's a lot of statistics out there. There's tons, and I could put them all in here. But one that just really stood out to me was that while Black women represent about 10% of the the population in this nation, they're about 40% of the victims of trafficking that have been identified. And so, I think. For us to do this work and not really acknowledge those statistics is detrimental.
Yeah.
Another study talked about by the FBI, 59% of child sex trafficking victims were children of color and African-American children. And so I think the disparity is undeniable. And I think even in some of our agencies, right, that disparity is even higher, right? The work that we do, I'm not seeing 40%. I'm seeing, 70, 80, 90% are people of color, and I acknowledge that where we're located in Houston may
Right.
impact some of that, but
Sure.
Broadly, that's an important conversation to have.
Yeah, that's so critical, because I think two things are really important about what you said. Number one, that there are studies, there are statistics done by agencies. I mean, the FBI, right,
Yeah.
and other agencies that are showing this, that are proving this out statistically. But at the same time, you're somebody who works at one of the epicenters of trafficking in this city, right? And Houston has long held this title of, number one city in the nation for trafficking, and that can be debated at
Right.
different times, but even it's just anecdotally you see this played out, and we do too at Elijah Rising, but I think there is some pushback that's like, well, if you can't prove it statistically, or if you don't see it, but what I hear you saying, Shani, is you're seeing it at both, that statistically it's being proven, and you're seeing it in your daily work on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the street and then our drop-in center, it reinforces the research that we're finding.
Right.
So, I think that's important.
Yeah. And I guess the question then too is, like, in the attempt, how dangerous is it to ignore racism while also, is it even possible to end it if we're not addressing the root causes, and one of them
Right.
being racism?
Yeah, I think that, when I think about the anti-trafficking movement, and I think the murder of George Floyd has really kind of thrust this conversation.
Sure.
And kind of made us look at this. And I think some of the conversations I've seen on social media or with friends is around the notion of I don't see color, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't see color, and perhaps the sentiment behind that is great. Maybe, you're saying that you don't discriminate based on color, but our victims are the victims that we serve, and these women need us to see color, right? Because we need to be able to understand their experiences. And I know we'll talk later, but, this I don't see color is a broad context.
Yeah.
It applies to people of color, who have not been trafficked. And so
Sure.
even more so for victims of trafficking who are, thoroughly marginalized, they really need us to open our eyes to that,
Yeah.
open our eyes to their experiences, and then to your point, will we do good work? If we don't do this, I don't think so. We can't do good work if we're not willing to address the things that really make them vulnerable in the first place.
Yeah, we mentioned this on the last episode, and I think it's just such a powerful quote that we use often, like, sex trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability.
Right.
And that vulnerability can be many things. It can be age, it can be gender.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is that it can also be race. It can also be skin tone. Yeah. So having worked with, personally knowing women who have been exploited, who have been prostituted, or maybe who are currently being trafficked on Bissonnette and other places in the city, I wonder, how do women on the track, on Bissonnette, how are they experiencing racism, systemic racism, in their daily life?
Yeah. So I think I want to approach this from two different ways,
Yeah.
right? There's a term called intersectionality that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a law professor at UCLA.
Yeah.
And then also from an ecological model, which are, models that we in social services kind of look at. We look at a person in their environment, right? In the context of their environment. We can't pull someone out of their environment and think that
Sure.
their experiences don't matter. And so those are the two ways that I kind of want to look at that. And intersectionality, it just describes a lot of different social identities, right? So we all have social identities, color, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity, socioeconomic status. All of these things make up who we are and how we experience the world, right? They also come with varying levels of oppression.
Right.
And disparity. And so I think about myself, right? I'm Black, and I'm also a woman, right? So we know that women have had their, and still do, have their challenges.
Sure.
And then people who are Black or people of color also have challenges. So intersectionality kind of explains the multiple levels of oppression that a person experiences. And I think it's really important for us to look at that, right? So I'm a Black woman, right? So my experiences are different than that of a Black man.
Right, sure.
And they're also different than that of a white woman. And I'm speaking from someone who has not experienced exploitation, right? And
right.
those things matter to me, right? So they
Right.
definitely matter to the people that we serve.
Yeah.
And then I think it's also important because I think what the anti-trafficking movement has done is we've focused on the trafficking only, right? And we have to look at this person as a whole person, right, who has experienced all of these different varying levels of oppression.
Right.
And so when we're thinking about the clients that we serve in the southwest side of Houston or just broadly, they experience oppression from a lot of different ways, right? A lot of different, we know that
Sure.
youth who identify as LGBTQ are also more vulnerable, right? So understanding these vulnerabilities is important, and addressing them and acknowledging them
And I would
is
assume
really important.
each one of those kind of comes with its own trauma too, right? Due to
Absolutely.
the oppression and whatever sort of social stigmas that intersectionality might create. And so, yeah, I'd wonder, just going back to the quote, earlier, like the exploitation of vulnerability, kind of what I hear you saying is like, well, this is just vulnerability upon vulnerability upon vulnerability, which leads to a situation where somebody is exploited.
Yeah, and I think that even in the programs that we're in now, oftentimes we're having to address and unpack a lot of other stuff before even getting to the trafficking, right? And so, choosing not to, acknowledge those, we really can't, assist people.
Right.
We can't serve them well. And then the other, thing that we want to look at as an ecological model, that we cannot take a person out of their environment without acknowledging all the things that they've experienced, right?
Right.
We all encounter systems in a different way, right? We've got lots of systems that our clients are interacting with. Educational system, the medical system, the school system. We've got CPS. And we know that people of color, there's been, talk in the last couple of years about, maternal death rates of, Black women, right? They experience the medical, system in a very different way.
Yeah.
Right? We think about the educational system and the school to prison pipeline and abuse to prison pipeline. And it's telling us that children of color are they're involved in the same system and not experiencing that system in the same way.
Right.
So that's what systemic, oppression is for us to kind of consider, how do people interact in their environment, they're in the context of their environment, and how does their environment interact with them, right?
Yeah.
How are they impacted by that? And I think one that stands out, and we could talk about it for multiple podcasts, is the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's make sure to mention that one, right?
Women of color in general, people of color, women of color, and then trafficking victims and those in the commercial sex industry are experiencing the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
We know that women of color are more likely to be arrested for prostitution than others, right? They're less likely to be identified as victims of trafficking or be considered victims of trafficking.
Yeah.
Youth of color are being detained more, arrested more, tried as adults more, and just given harsher sentences. And so I think those are things that, that we have to really consider. I think about Centoya Brown and Letitia Clay and, more recently, like the Free Mia hashtag, right? These are all child sex trafficking victims of color who experience the criminal justice system and the brutality of that system, in their lives.
They were put behind bars as children.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's important that's, what our clients, that's who we're trying to serve. This is what they're experiencing. So we cannot, treat them, as a one size fits all, right? Like this program outlines, this is how we're going to go through this program, without being willing to address these things.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of goes back to the colorblind conversation too. It's not that anybody's trying to not see skin tone. It's just that you have to understand. Would you say that you have to understand the cultural experience that comes with that skin color or that background or the neighborhood that they come from? It's not that we don't want to see the color, it's that we have to see all of those factors that are coming into the doors of the landing when they're seeking services.
Absolutely. yeah, I think that's a perfect way to, synthesize that, and that we have to see people for their experiences, right? And we cannot, pull apart, what we want to work with and not being willing to work with,
Sure.
all these other experiences.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. How about demand? You drive down Bissonnette every day? Yes. Are you?
Yeah, just about
Almost?
every day. Yeah.
You see demand in real life. I mean, and you see it in the you hear it in the stories of the women that you serve, the people that you serve. Do you see any racial bias on the part of buyers toward Black women on the street?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're right. Buyers are predominantly white men. This is not just anecdotal. This is, research, right?
Right.
Says that men who have, social power, political power, financial power, right? And they also do this with impunity. So I think there is some, that we can talk about systemic racism there, or oppression there, right? That, a study in 2015 talks about, we all know that prostitution in Texas currently is illegal, right? It takes 2, sometimes 3 people to, or more. But we know that sellers of sex, and often women of color, are often arrested at much higher rates than, the buyers of sex. And so there's some oppression there, right? There's some systemic issues that we're seeing when it comes to buyers and sellers of sex. The other thing is, we think about the pornography, right?
Yeah.
Women of color are overrepresented in pornography as well. And that's important for us to look at. In pornography, there's a lot of, racial undertones, overtones, and even, some extreme violence in that towards women of color. And so, though they're being fetishized often, they're also being brutalized. And so I think that is a really good question. That could take a lot of time as well, but just unpacking like the power disparity there. When we think about who buyers generally are, and who, victims or women working in the sex industry generally are.
We're going to take a break in the podcast for just a minute and come back, and we will discuss more with Shani.
Hey everybody, I hope you are enjoying today's episode of the Elijah Rising podcast. Right now I'm standing in the Elijah Rising store that sells goods that empower survivors of sex trafficking. All the items in this shop, the purchases support the employment as well as the restoration of women that are in our program. So please come visit us at 11th and Studewood, or online at shop.elijahrising.org. And today, on your first purchase, we're going to offer you $10 off if you shop online using code PODCAST.
Welcome back to the podcast. I am joined by Shani Bacy, Director of Strategic Programs at The Landing. Shani, do women in the life experience racism when it comes to social services? And I think more specifically what I'm wondering is in finding the restorative care, whether it be short-term or long-term, to exit the life.
Yeah. That's a tough question. So I'm going to start off by saying there are a lot of great programs out there. A lot of which are, local as well. But then thinking on your question, I do think, victims of color, survivors of color experience bias, when they're entering programs or aftercare programs, receiving services. I think it, manifests itself in a couple of ways. So one, finding culturally competent services.
Yeah, that's good.
And then when we're looking at program outcomes and success. And this reminded me of a story. Maybe several years ago, I was meeting with an agency that is not local to Houston or Texas. I'll put that out there. And they were explaining to me that they were going to start operations in California to do street outreach work. But then shortly after starting, they shut down their operations because the women on the street had attitudes. And so, I was just kind of stunned by that. One, we're wanting to work with this population, right? But then there was a bias about what the type of victim that they want to serve is. And so that was, it was convicting to me, right? To make me want to continue to check biases. We all have them, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But then to know that, our clients and victims are experiencing service providers that may not understand, cultural competence, right? Or even have a focus on wanting to be culturally competent, right?
Yeah.
Because we know that women who are working the streets, which is the program that they were seeking to develop, are often the most vulnerable, right? They're often people of color. We know that those are the low-hanging fruit, and so to not acknowledge the trauma, right? The trauma discharge, not acknowledge why we might perceive their behavior as having an attitude, is challenging. And so, I think that, as social service agencies, we definitely have to continue to check that, right?
Yeah.
What is the ideal client, right? What level of trauma are we willing to deal with, right? Because when we think about people of color, they're coming with a lot of trauma, right? We've got some generational trauma, historical trauma. We have victims of trafficking, and all these levels of oppression. So we have to know if we're even able and competent to really deal with those things. And then I think on the flip side of that, also being willing to learn how to, right? Because then I don't want to say close the door because you're not able to. But if you want to serve trafficking victims, you have to be ready to deal with all of the things that they bring. And so that was one example, but I can see it happening that, in other agencies that we refer to, sometimes we have to be very careful, right? Like, who am I going to refer this client to? Because I know they will not be successful here.
Oh, interesting.
We have agencies that really kind of need to think about practices, right? We have to make sure we're meeting the needs of survivors of color, right? Because, the Black community, we have our own norms. We have a culture. We have different hair care needs. We have a lot of different things that need to be addressed in these programs. And when a survivor comes to a program, whether it's residential or just any other kind of service, they have to feel heard and that their needs are being met, right? And so I think that's another way that survivors of color, victims of color are potentially experiencing bias in some of these agencies. I also think about, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I know that's a controversial, topic, but what we're saying is that these issues matter, and it's the same thing with the clients that we're serving. These issues matter. The things that they are experiencing, the things that they need are different, and then they also matter. And so
they're very real factors to their ability to heal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they have to be understood so that, I think you said it a second ago, like the whole person. We see the whole person. We're working with the whole person. We're providing an atmosphere in which the whole person can be restored.
Right.
And so we have to understand all of those things that come in with that person. It's interesting. You mentioned the hair care product thing. It's like, sometimes, we love our donors and we get all sorts of in-kind donations and it really keeps the organization running. But, occasionally we do have to say, hey, we need hair care products, but we need a very specific type of hair care products, right? Because
it matters, right?
It makes
does
a big
matter.
difference.
And we have wonderful donors and wonderful supporters. Oftentimes just don't know, right? And so I think that's the beauty of this, conversation too, is to kind of, shed light on these issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, we appreciate you shedding light on some of these issues, not only as somebody who comes with so much experience in the field and in this work, but also as a Black woman yourself, and so that kind of helps me transition a little bit to the next question. As a leader, and we really do, I mean, I see you as a leader in this movement, especially here in Houston, and having worked with numerous organizations, and approached the issue of sex trafficking from a few different facets. From your experience, do you think that there is a sufficient amount of respect for, and let me add, a listening to Black voices in the anti-trafficking movement?
That's another tough question. I think that I've seen agencies taking steps towards this. I think the the challenge could be that this could be superficial, right? Like,
Yeah.
we've done it in the trafficking movement, anti-trafficking movement, where we got to get survivors on our board, right? Just to say we got a survivor on our board.
Right.
So I think we could, we could do things the wrong way and try to get, Black women or Black people to the table without
Just
truly,
tokenism.
That's a perfect way to say that, without really, honoring their voice, right? But I do think there has been movement towards that. Do we have a ways to go? I think yes, right? And I think some of the, the conversation now is, are they on your staff? Yes, but are they in executive leadership? Are they in a position to make some key decisions on behalf of clients that need to, that need their voice and they need their advocacy? And so, I think that we have a ways to go. And then I also want to be clear that, there's room in this work for everyone, right? There is room for everyone. There is enough work to do.
Yeah, that's true.
And we would be remiss to not honor the work that people who are not Black have done in this space. So I want to be clear about that. But there is also a real need to have Black voices elevated and truly honored, in this space. And I think also too, like, we can think about an advocacy perspective, right? We need Black voices in, speaking into legislation and things like that, because how many times have we seen lobbying and activism go wrong for the Black community, right?
Sure.
There's laws that are passed, and we can think about the war on drugs, right? Even trafficking, bills or things like that have just impacted communities of color in a very real way, in a very negative way. And so it's important that these Black voices are also elevated at an advocacy level as well.
Yeah, so it's not enough to just put a Black person in a position.
Right.
But what you're saying is their voices have to count.
Yeah, their voices have to count.
Equally. Their perspective has to be on the same plane of viability, importance, hearing as, well, just every other voice in the room. And because it seems like there's a real danger in that tokenism, where you just bring somebody in and then you say, okay, now you have a seat at the table, but you know what? We're still probably just going to build things the way that we see that we need to build them.
Yeah.
And then we might build them in a way that's harmful to the Black community.
Right.
Without taking into consideration all of that intersectionality and all of those different factors that that lead to vulnerabilities, perhaps, that lead to trafficking. Yeah. So how about awareness? How about prevention? How about advocacy programs, as we were talking about? I wonder, do you think that that we're providing, enough awareness, that we're doing enough advocacy, that we're doing enough prevention, specifically when it comes to Black communities, Black neighborhoods, predominantly Black areas of town? Are programs sufficiently offered for them to understand the problem?
So I think that when we look at prevention and awareness, we have to look at underlying issues, right? And I think as a movement, we've done a lot of presentations.
We do that, don't we?
We do a lot of curriculums to children.
Sure.
We go into schools, sometimes in the Black community, not always, right? There are some gaps there, right? There has to be a level of cultural competency. The presentation that we are providing needs to meet the needs of that community.
Know your audience.
Yeah, know your audience.
Yeah.
But then also when we think about prevention, what truly prevents trafficking, right? Does my presentation truly prevent trafficking? It might raise some awareness. They may be able to do a pre and post test and kind of explain some things, but the factors that create vulnerability, have they been addressed, right? Because when they're not addressed, then we do prevention programs. It doesn't change the fact that this kid is still vulnerable, right?
Said.
It means that they can now answer questions about trafficking.
Right.
And so I think when we talk about the Black community and prevention, we have to really think about what prevents trafficking, right? What are their needs? What causes a child to be exploited, right? That's what prevention really is.
So we need an increase. There's more work to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
There's more work to be done. Well, I want to thank you for your voice. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your willingness to to sit down with me at this table. I want to thank you for your willingness to teach us from your own experience. As an expert in this field and as somebody who has given your life to it, but also as a woman of color who lives, in this reality that we find ourselves in every single day. And so you are someone that I look up to as who has just given their whole being to this fight for so long. And I just want to say thank you again, because it's not easy work, is it? I mean, it's not easy work, but it's work that's worth it. And this is it has taken us too long to have these conversations. And so I just wonder, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important for those who are listening to hear?
Yeah. So again, thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be in this fight alongside of you and your agency and Elijah Rising. And I've found this very refreshing to be able to be open and honest about things
that's awesome.
that are uncomfortable to a lot of people to discuss. I think that we could leave here, or not us, but, listeners could leave and they could either be offended or they could be open, right? And I think if I were to leave anything, that's my hope, is that we would be open to learning about the experiences of others. And in this space, when we care about trafficking, we care about exploitation of people, we have to be open to hear their experiences.
Absolutely.
I think that... I'm guessing that the death of George Floyd is what has kind of, encouraged you to kind of have these conversations. And I think it's also awakened the nation to just the experiences of people of color. And I pray that the anti-trafficking community is also awakened, that we kind of follow suit behind that. And are willing to address, ourselves, right, and self-reflect, on how we engage with people of color,
right,
and how do we participate in this. We should take a deep dive into our policies and our procedures, and I don't say this without knowing that means work, right? Because I've written programs, and I know that means work when you have to go and unravel and dismantle a program that you've found to be successful for some, but maybe not for others. And so that's kind of where I leave. And I would like to read some words. I'm going to read directly from the screen from Rachel Lloyd. And she is a survivor of human trafficking. We know that she's been a pioneer in this work. She's not a person of color, but this is about openness, right? And so I'm going to read exactly what she's written. She wrote it some years ago. I don't want to say that it was somebody else's hashtag. So it wasn't George Floyd. It may have been Mike Brown or somebody else. But she says, you can't say you care about human trafficking victims of color without taking a moment to understand how race impacts their lives. You can't talk about prevention of commercial sexual exploitation without addressing poverty and how race and class are inextricably linked in this country. You can't talk about options for survivors in aftercare without acknowledging that those options look different for different survivors. You can't sit quietly by on the sidelines because all this talk about race makes you uncomfortable. You can't pick and choose your social justice issues like you're at a buffet bar. All of this is linked, all of it is interconnected, and all of this is indeed related to commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking in all forms. And it was just powerful then, and it's powerful now, that addressing sexual exploitation requires that we address the systems that oppress people and make them vulnerable. And so, we just can't let this die down. We have to, survivors and victims are dependent on us not allowing this to stop, and so, and that's really... I think the last piece, but I really want to leave with her words because they were just so powerful to me.
Yeah, that is powerful. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often say, sex trafficking really is the intersection of all the social justice issues. It's poverty, it's immigration, it's racial justice, it's homelessness, it's addiction.
All of it matters.
All of these things, you know what I mean? Whether they were the vulnerabilities or they were entered into after, as a coping mechanism and all these things. So that was very powerful, a very powerful quote. I wonder, Do you have any other resources that you'd recommend for our audience and for us to read?
Yeah. And so thinking about how things are not always about trafficking, right? There's all these other systems that clients or individuals are experiencing. So one that I listed was 13th, the documentary 13th.
Yeah.
It talks about systemic racism in the criminal justice system. So it's not predominantly about trafficking, but it does really shed light on how a person of color can experience the criminal justice system. Similarly, When They See Us is another that kind of explains how racial disparities play out in the lives of youth of color in the criminal justice system. Girlhood Interrupted is a study about the adultification of Black girls. The Racial Roots of Human Trafficking is a publication out of UCLA that I've used frequently.
We were just reading it earlier today.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, and it's been out for years, but it's been very helpful. And then The Urgency of Intersectionality, it's a TED Talk. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. So those are some things. There's tons of resources out there, but those are some that have really allowed me to see and understand this systematic racism and all of these things in a deeper way.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate those recommendations. And if you're listening, we'll put those in the show notes. You know exactly where to find those. Shani, how can we support you? How can we support you, your work? Tell us what we can do. Tell the audience what they can do to help you.
Yeah. So we mentioned earlier that I work at The Landing. And so we encourage people to get involved in 3 ways. One by praying, one by serving, and one by giving. So really prayer is, at the root of this, right?
Yeah.
We need to pray. And then we have right now service opportunities are limited due to COVID, but in general, we have a lot of opportunities for volunteers and individuals to get engaged in the work. And then giving is always another opportunity. So you can check out our website, learn more about the work that we do, and how you can get involved. It's www.thelanding.org.
Awesome. Shani, thank you again for being you and bringing your voice to this conversation, and serving others, and really serving us and our listeners today with your voice. And so, for more information about Elijah Rising, you can go to our website, elijahrising.org. You can also shop our social enterprise goods at shop.elijahrising.org. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can also find a video version of it on YouTube. I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening or watching, so that you can be updated the second that a new episode releases. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, all the different places. We appreciate your support, and we want to just ask for your feedback. Let us know what you think. Join the conversation. Send us your questions for future podcasts, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Elijah Rising podcast.